My name is Gretchen Kessler. I am 39 years old, and I am a major in the United States Air Force. I am a 15 Whiskey X-ray, which means I am a weather officer with a Special Operations Duty designation. I am a certified Special Operations, weather team officer embedded with Air Force Special Operations Command in direct support of Joint Special Operations Task Force West Africa. I held that assignment for 3 consecutive years, and during that time, I provided ground truth meteorological intelligence for rotary wing insertion and extraction corridors in denied environments across sub-Saharan Africa. My classification level is sensitive compartmented information with special access program authorization. That is a sentence I have never spoken aloud to my father, to my family, to anyone at the cookout I am about to describe to you. What they knew about me, what my father allowed them to know about me was this. I do contract analysis work for a Department of Defense vendor. Nothing exciting. A lot of travel. I cannot say more than that. That was the line I was permitted to give, and I gave it the same way you give a compass bearing precisely, without variation, without elaboration, without a single unnecessary syllable, because in my world unnecessary syllables kill people. But my father, Henry Kessler, 66 years old, long-haul truck driver, a man who had spent 40 years on highways, where the only weather that mattered was whether he could see the next quarter mile, did not hear precision when I spoke those words. He heard evasion. He heard guilt. He heard the silence that followed my answer, not as discipline, but as confirmation of every assumption he had already decided was true. And in that space between what I said and what he heard, he built an entirely different version of my life. And he told that version to 40 people at a cookout in July. And he had been telling it for 3 years. And the only reason he got away with it for that long is because the truth was classified, and I was not allowed to defend myself. And I had sworn an oath that meant more to me than any family gathering ever could. If you have ever had someone rewrite your life, while you were busy living it, if you have ever stood in a room full of people who thought they knew you based on a lie told by someone who was supposed to protect you, then hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this story is about to get under your skin in a way that stays there. Let me take you back, because what happened at that cookout did not start in July, and it did not start with my father opening his mouth in the middle of a backyard full of relatives. It started years before I ever set foot on African soil, before I ever watched a class for Haboob devour a horizon, before I ever felt the particular kind of silence that comes when an encrypted radio channel goes from signal to nothing, and you understand that you are completely alone in a place that wants to kill you. I was commissioned through ROTC at 25, which is a late start by military standards. I had taken my time finishing school, working summers figuring out whether I had the precision for the kind of work I wanted to do, because I understood early that precision is not a talent, it is a discipline, and I was not sure I had earned the right to it yet. I did. The Air Force confirmed it. Weather Officer Pipeline, then SWT Selections Special Operations Weather Team. The training alone took years, and it broke people. It broke people who were stronger than me, faster than me, more confident than me. It broke them not because the physical standards were impossible, but because the mental standards were absolute. You learn to read the atmosphere the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. Convective instability, upper air trajectory modeling, wind shear gradients in terminal approach zones. You learn that a 2-degree error does not mean a delayed flight. It means 11 people in a falling aircraft. You learn that the difference between a viable insertion window and a death sentence can be the direction of wind shear at 1,200 feet that no one on the ground can feel. You learn to trust instruments when your instincts are screaming at you, and to trust your instincts when every instrument says the window is clear, but something in the pressure data makes your hands go still. I was good at it. Not because I was brave, because I was still. Because math tells the truth, and the atmosphere tells the truth, and I trusted both of those things more than I trusted the sound of my own voice or the sound of anyone else's. By 2018, I was a captain with 8 years of service, and I received orders for a 3-year embedded assignment with Joint Special Operations Task Force West Africa. I would be attached to 3rd Special Forces Group. I would provide weather authorization for helicopter assault insertions in Mali, Niger, and the surrounding theater. I would live in hardened compounds. I would not be reachable by normal channels. I would not explain this to anyone outside my chain of command. I told Aaron, my husband, not the details, the shape of it. We were standing in the kitchen of the house. We had bought 2 years earlier the house, with the fence where Marcus would later chase his cousins around a lawn sprinkler, while his grandfather destroyed me 30 feet away. I told Aaron I was leaving for 3 years, and I could not tell him where or why beyond the broadest outline. He held my hand in that kitchen, and he said, "I will be here." That was it. No conditions, no questions. I could not answer, no performance of concern designed to make me feel guilty for leaving. He kissed Marcus on the head. Marcus was 5. He would not understand the absence. He would only feel it the way a child feels whether they cannot name a shift in pressure, a change in the light, the way a room feels different when one specific person is no longer in it. I told my father I had a contract analysis assignment. A lot of travel. I could not say more. He heard what he wanted to hear. He has always heard what he wanted to hear because Henry Kessler is a man who decided a long time ago that the version of the world he carries inside him is the only version worth consulting, and any information that contradicts it is not new information. It is a lie delivered by someone who lacks the courage to tell him what he already knows. That is not cruelty, that is architecture. That is the structure of a mind that has never been forced to account for itself because it has never encountered a force powerful enough to require it. Until a retired colonel standing near a cooler full of beer decided he had heard enough. The compound in Niger smelled like diesel exhaust and recycled air. That is an important detail because smell is the sense most closely tied to memory, and the memory of that smell lives in a place in my brain that I cannot access voluntarily, but that activates without warning when certain conditions are met. The sound I woke to most mornings was the whine of MH60 turbines spooling up at 0400. That particular pitch lives in my ears. I hear it sometimes now when a neighbor starts a lawnmower, and I have learned to let it pass without my hands going still, without my breath changing, without any visible sign that something inside me has briefly relocated to a place it does not want to be. That is its own form of discipline. Not the discipline of training, but the discipline of survival, the ongoing daily maintenance of a self that has been fractured and reassembled so many times that the seams have become structural. In March of 2019, I authorized the weather window for a helicopter assault insertion into Mali. Direct action against an AQIM-affiliated network. I provided the synoptic analysis, the convective instability assessment, the wind shear calculations for the terminal approach. I confirmed the window was viable. 11 people boarded that aircraft on my word. 11 people whose names I knew, whose faces I had seen in the briefing room, whose families I understood existed somewhere on the other side of an ocean that none of them were thinking about in the minutes before the door opened and the rotors pulled them into air that I had promised would hold them. The mission went. The insertion was clean. The target was engaged. The egress did not go. A Class 4 Haboob materialized faster than the models predicted. A sand wall 60 feet high moving at 40 knots. It hit our forward observation position during extraction. If you have never seen a Class 4 Haboob, I cannot make you understand it with words, but I will try. Imagine the horizon disappearing. Not gradually, not like fog rolling in, but all at once as if someone has pulled a sheet across the world. The air goes from clear to amber to opaque in seconds. The wind does not blow the sand becomes the wind. Every particle of silica moving at ballistic velocity, every square inch of exposed skin being abraded simultaneously, the pressure dropping so fast your ears pop, and then fill with a sound that is not wind and not sand and not silence, but something between all three that your brain has no category for. The encrypted radio went to static. Then it went dead. That is the sound I return to on my worst nights. Not the howl of the storm, not the feeling of sand in my eyes and mouth and lungs, but the specific quality of silence that replaces an encrypted channel when it goes from signal to nothing. The exact moment I understood I was alone. Not alone in the way you feel alone in an empty house. Alone in the way you feel alone when the only link between you and every other human being on the planet is a frequency that has just stopped carrying your voice. I had a silver base plate compass. I had the stars when the sand settled enough to see them, which was not for hours. I had the training. I started walking. 19 hours, 273 magnetic. 9 miles of bearing drift to correct. The Malian desert is 110 degrees by day and 55 after midnight. The sand cools faster than you expect, but the ground holds heat the way concrete holds heat, and it radiates up through the soles of your boots long after the air above you has gone cold. The burns do not come from fire. They come from the sun reflecting off silica for 11 straight hours with no cover and no shade and no option but forward. You do not feel them happening. The nerve endings on your face and neck are the first to go, and by the time the pain arrives, it is not sharp, it is deep and diffuse. And it does not feel like burning, it feels like something being taken from you layer by layer. By the time I walked back in the 2nd degree, burns across my face and neck had already begun to blister. The hyperpigmented scarring that settled along my left jaw and down the left side of my neck has never faded. It is pale against my collar on cold days. It reddens in heat. I do not explain it. I have never explained it. My family thinks it is a skin condition. A dermatologist appointment my father once suggested I make, as though a cream exists for the distance between what he assumed about my life and what my life actually was. I spent 5 days on IV recovery in the compound medical bay. During those 5 days, a young Green Beret on my team, Sergeant Nolan, was killed by a vehicle-borne IED on a separate patrol. He was 26. He had given me a paracord bracelet 2 weeks before. The team mission number woven into the pattern. His wife sent a note afterward. She said he told her I was the toughest person on the team. He meant it. I wear that bracelet every day. It is on my left wrist right now as I tell you this. The cord is faded now from years of where the pattern's still visible, but soft the way things get soft when they have been touched enough times. My father has never asked what it means. He has seen it on my wrist at every family gathering for 5 years, and he has never once asked what it means, because asking would require acknowledging that it might mean something, and acknowledging that it might mean something would require acknowledging that I might have done something, and acknowledging that I might have done something would require abandoning the story he had already chosen to tell. So he never asked. That is the kind of silence I grew up with, not the silence of classification. The silence of willful disinterest, disguised as authority. Now I need to tell you what happened in December of that year, because this is the part that changes what happened at that cookout from a family disagreement into something that has weight, something that has consequences, something that exists in a record that will outlast every person who was standing in that yard. While I was still in theater, Marcus had his first grade winter concert. He was 6. Aaron attended. He sat in the 3rd row of folding chairs in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and construction paper, and the particular nervous energy of parents holding phone cameras at angles they would later delete and retake. He recorded 68 seconds of video. Marcus in a white shirt, one size too big, singing with his mouth open wider than any other kid in the row, his eyes scanning the audience until he found Aaron and then staying there, locked on. The way a child locks onto the one face that means safe. The way a compass needle locks onto magnetic north, not because it chooses to, but because something deeper than choice pulls it there. I watched that video 5 days later on a classified phone in a hardened compound in Niger during a lunch break that lasted 11 minutes. The phone locked after one viewing. Security protocol. I watched it twice more from memory in the months that followed. The shape of Marcus' mouth, the way his eyes found Aaron and stopped searching. He did not know to look for anyone else. He was 6, and his mother was a voice on a phone that came at irregular intervals, and a face on a screen that appeared and disappeared according to schedules he could not understand. I was 3 weeks past walking 19 hours through a desert. My face was still peeling. The tinnitus from the sandstorm pressure waves had not yet been diagnosed. I managed it later with white noise machines that Aaron believes are for sleep hygiene, and I have never corrected that belief because sleep hygiene is a harmless explanation, and the truth is not a harmless thing to carry into a bedroom at night. My family believed I was in Florida living with some man whose name my father invented. That is the cost, not the burns, not the desert, not the radio going dead. Not the 19 hours or the IV recovery or the memorial for a 26-year-old Green Beret whose bracelet I will wear until the cord disintegrates. The cost is a 68-second video of your son singing watched once on a phone that will not let you watch it again in a room that smells like nothing because the air has been recycled so many times it has forgotten what outside is. And your father back home telling the family you just did not want to be there. Telling them at Christmas. Telling them at his brother retirement party. Telling them at a cousin graduation. Telling them with the easy authority of a man who has never been challenged, because no one in the family had reason to doubt him, and the one person who could have corrected him was bound by a classification level that none of them would have understood even if she had spoken the words aloud. It was not confusion. It was not a mistake. It was a story he had chosen to tell for so long that it had become the family truth. And he had never once considered that the truth itself was waiting in the same yard. Now I need to tell you what my father did while I was gone. Not what he said, what he did. In 2020, during my second year in theater, Hank Kessler filed a formal dependent inquiry with Air Force Personnel Command. He claimed I had abandoned family obligations. He requested a welfare check. The inquiry generated an administrative flag on my personnel file. That flag triggered a clearance review. My command spent 2 weeks clearing it during an active operational period. 2 weeks of administrative capacity diverted from mission support because my father decided his version of my life was the one that needed investigating. 2 weeks where lawyers and commanders and security officers who should have been focused on keeping people alive were instead focused on documenting that a dependent inquiry filed by a long-haul trucker in the Midwest had no basis in fact and was inconsistent with the service record of an active duty officer in a classified assignment. He never told me he filed it. I found out through my chain of command in a briefing room where I was told that an administrative flag had been placed on my file and was being resolved, and that the source of the flag was a dependent inquiry from my home of record. I sat in that briefing room, and I felt something I had not felt before in Niger or Mali or any of the other places, where the danger was external and visible, and shaped like a sandstorm or an IED. I felt something that came from inside the perimeter, something that came from home, and there was something else. A commendation certificate signed personally by the colonel who commanded my task force. It documented my performance during the Mali mission, the 19-hour navigation, the weather authorization that kept 11 people alive. Standard procedure for classified personnel was to mail the certificate to the service member home of record. My home of record was my father address. The certificate arrived. Hank intercepted it. He destroyed it. I never knew it had been sent. I never knew it existed. Not until that cookout. Not until a retired colonel standing near a cooler full of beer decided he had heard enough. Think about that for a moment. A piece of paper with my name on it, signed by a man who had sat in a tactical operations center and refused to close a search window when pressure came from above to do exactly that. A piece of paper that said I had done something worth documenting. My father held it in his hands, and he destroyed it because it did not fit the story he had chosen to tell. That is not a misunderstanding. That is not a father who was confused about his daughter career. That is a man who looked at evidence that contradicted his narrative and eliminated the evidence rather than revise the narrative. And he did it while I was in a country he could not find on a map doing work. He could not comprehend for people whose names he would never know, risking things he would never have the courage to risk. He destroyed my commendation, and he filed a false report, and he told 40 people I was lying, and he did all of it from the safety of a backyard in the Midwest, while I was eating meals that tasted like recycled air, and waking up to the sound of turbines at 0400, and watching a 68-second video of my son that a classified phone would only let me see once. Now I need to take you to the cookout. The cookout was a Saturday in late July. Hank backyard Midwest suburb, flat heat pressing down on everything like a hand. The smell of charcoal and cut grass, no wind at all. The sky was bright and featureless, the kind of sky that gives you nothing to read. I noticed that when I arrived, no weather, just heat, just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels like the hour before something changes. I am a weather officer. I read sky the way other people read faces. I look at pressure and humidity and wind direction, and I understand what is coming before it arrives. That sky told me nothing, and that nothing felt deliberate, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. 40 relatives, burgers and brats on a kettle grill, corn on the cob in a foil tray, potato salad from Hank girlfriend recipe, deviled eggs on a plastic platter, watermelon halved and salted, a cooler of beer no one was counting carefully. Paper plates flapping slightly in the residual heat convection rising off the grass. The food was abundant and ordinary, and I folded my napkin beside my untouched paper plate within the first 20 minutes because my stomach had closed the moment I walked through the gate and saw the foam core poster board near the picnic tables. Kessler Family Summer 2023. Printed phone photos assembled by Hank girlfriend. 3 years of family events. Hank brother retirement. A cousin graduation. A 4th of July from 2 summers ago. Christmas at Hank house. I was not in a single photograph. 3 years of my family life arranged on foam core and the space where I should have been just more photos of other people. Other people eating, other people smiling, other people standing in the spaces I would have stood if the version of my life that Hank had constructed had left room for me to exist in it. I stood near that board for 11 seconds. I counted. Not because I was performing the counting, not because I wanted someone to notice. I counted because counting is what I do when the thing in front of me cannot be processed emotionally, and I need to buy time for my brain to find a framework for it. 11 seconds. Then I walked to the edge of the yard and found a folding chair where I could see Marcus playing with his cousins near the fence. He was 11 now. He was laughing. He did not know what was on that poster board. He did not know that 3 years of his family visual history had been curated to exclude his mother. He was chasing a cousin around a lawn sprinkler and the water was catching the afternoon light, and for a moment everything in that yard was exactly what it looked like. A cookout. A family. A summer Saturday. Hank found me within the hour. Not to greet me. To introduce me. The Pattersons from 3 houses down had walked over. Hank, beer in hand, one arm wide like he was presenting inventory. This is my other daughter. She does some kind of contractor work. Nothing too exciting. He said it within my earshot. I heard every word. I did not turn my head. Other daughter. Not my daughter who serves. Not my daughter who went somewhere. My other daughter. As though the word other was a disclaimer, a preemptive apology for the disappointment that followed. She does some kind of contractor work. Not she is a major in the United States Air Force. Not she has a classification level that requires background checks and polygraphs and annual reinvestigations. She does some kind of contractor work. Nothing too exciting. The nothing was the blade. The two was the handle. He was handing the Pattersons a version of me that was small enough to hold and dull enough not to cut, and I sat in my folding chair, and I did not turn my head. 20 minutes later, I heard him say it again to a different neighbor. Same phrasing, same gesture, same dismissal, delivered like a weather report he had given so many times the words had lost their meaning. I watched cousin Tommy arrive in his Army National Guard polo. Hank crossed the yard to shake his hand. Tommy the real deal. 1 weekend a month and he out there doing it. He clapped Tommy on the back. Tommy smiled. It was a genuine smile. Tommy had no idea he was being used. He had no idea that the hand on his back was not praise, but a proper way for Hank to demonstrate that he understood what real military service looked like as opposed to whatever his daughter claimed she was doing. Hank had never clapped me on the back. Not once. Not for anything. Not for my commissioning, not for my assignment, not for the burns on my face that he had never asked about. I was near the fence when I heard it. Hank was at the grill with his brother-in-law Dale. He believed I was inside the house. I was 20 feet away standing in the grass watching Marcus chase a cousin around a lawn sprinkler. She will just sit there and take it. She always does. His voice carried the way voices carry on flat ground with no wind. Clear and unself-conscious, the voice of a man who has said these words before and has never been corrected. She does not have anything to say because there is nothing to say. He was laughing when he said it. Dale was not laughing. Dale was holding his plate and looking at the ground. Ruth was standing on the patio. Hank, older sister, 68 years old. She heard every word. I watched her face. She did not move. She did not speak, but something behind her eyes shifted. The way a weather pattern shifts when the pressure drops and the air has not caught up yet. Ruth looked across the yard. She found me. She saw that I had heard. I held her gaze for 1 second. Then I looked back at Marcus. My hands were at my sides. My face was still. The burn scar along my left jaw was reddened from the heat. It always reddens in heat. I have stopped noticing. But Ruth noticed. I could see her looking at it the way she had looked at it a dozen times before at family gatherings over the years, and I could see something changing behind her eyes as the context of that scar shifted without her understanding how or why it was shifting. The retired colonel was standing near the cooler. He had arrived an hour earlier with his son Derek, my neighbor. I had waved at Derek. Derek had introduced his father. This is my dad, Ray. He visiting for the weekend. I had shaken his hand. He held the handshake one beat too long. His gaze paused on my jawline on the scar, then moved past. Polite controlled, the kind of controlled you learn when you have spent 30 years in rooms where controlling your face is a professional requirement. The retired colonel near the cooler had been watching since he arrived. He had not said anything yet. They had not counted on him being there. They had not counted on Derek inviting his father for the weekend. They had not counted on a man who had signed my mission orders and sat in a tactical operations center during the 19 hours I was walking through a desert, standing 30 feet from the man who had spent 3 years turning my service into a punchline. The geometry of that afternoon was an accident, but what the colonel did with that accident was not. The heat built through the afternoon. The sky stayed blank. 40 relatives ate and drank and moved through the yard in the loose orbit of people who share a last name, but not much else. Marcus was laughing near the sprinkler. Aaron stood slightly apart from the main group, arms at his sides, a beer going warm in his hand. He was watching me, not worried, waiting. He had been waiting for years, the way he waited for everything, without noise, without performance, just present. The kind of presence that does not require acknowledgement to function. I had told him years ago, when it matters, I will handle it myself. He was keeping that promise by doing nothing, and the steady certainty in his face, the quiet in his posture, told the yard everything it needed to know about a man who had trusted his wife through 6 years of silence without once demanding she fill it. It happened at 4:15. The sun was still high enough to press its weight on everything. Hank walked to the center of the yard near the poster board. He had his phone in his hand. He raised his voice the way he always raised his voice, which is to say, he simply spoke and let the size of him do the rest. I want to say something, and I want everyone to hear it. 40 relatives turned. My daughter Gretchen has been telling this family for years that she works for some contractor doing analysis for the Department of Defense. He held up his phone. I looked into it. There is no enlistment record under her name in any searchable military database. No unit that will confirm her service, no medals, no base she has ever mentioned, not one photograph of her in uniform. He paused. He let the silence do what he had trained it to do. She was gone for 3 years. She told us it was work. I am telling you what I have always told you. She was in Florida. She had personal problems she will not admit. And the story she has been telling is exactly that. A story. He turned to look at me. 40 faces followed his. She cannot tell us where she was because there is nowhere worth mentioning. He almost laughed. You drive to work in the morning and drive home at night. I have done harder work on a Tuesday. The kettle grill had been sizzling steadily. The charcoal had burned past the active phase. The sizzle stopped. The yard went from ambient noise to dead air in the same breath. I did not move. My hands were at my sides. I located Marcus in my field of vision. He had stopped running. He was standing near the fence watching his grandfather, not understanding, but sensing the weight of the silence the way children sense whether they cannot name. The way I had sensed whether my whole career. The way a 6-year-old senses that something has shifted in the air even when the sky is clear, and the adults are speaking in voices that sound normal, but are not normal because normal voices do not make rooms go silent. I was still. The retired colonel near the cooler set his plate down on the folding table beside him precisely without looking at it. The movement was small. No one noticed. But I noticed because I had spent 3 years noticing small movements, because small movements in the wrong context mean something is about to happen. The yard waited for me to break. 40 faces, some embarrassed, some expectant, a few already nodding, because Hank had told them this story so many times that hearing it spoken aloud in public in the bright dead heat of a July afternoon felt less like an accusation and more like a confirmation of something they had already decided was true. I adjusted the paracord bracelet on my left wrist. Slow, deliberate, the way you check a compass before a bearing. The woven cord was warm from the heat. The mission number pressed into my skin where it had pressed every day for 5 years. Sergeant Nolan Hands had tied that knot. 26 years old, vehicle-borne IED, a wife who sent a note. I straightened the bracelet, once aligned it against the bone of my wrist, and let my hand fall back to my side. That was it. That was everything I gave them. There are things you cannot explain to the people who love you. Not because you do not trust them, but because the country asked you not to and you said yes. And saying yes meant accepting that the people who love you would fill the silence with whatever story made them most comfortable, and you would have to live inside that story without being able to open it from the inside and show them what was actually there. Hank was still standing near the poster board. He had the posture of a man who had just won something. Shoulders back, phone still raised like evidence in a courtroom he had built himself. His eyes moved across the yard, collecting the reactions. He wanted the nods, the silence, the way his brother-in-law Dale stared at his shoes, the way his girlfriend pressed her lips together in a thin line that meant loyalty, not agreement. He looked at me last. He always looked at me last. Nothing to say, Gretchen. I held his gaze. My hands stayed at my sides. The burn scar along my left jaw was reddened from the heat disappearing beneath my collar the way it always did. I did not turn my head. I work in analysis. 3 words. The same 3 words I had given for 6 years. The same deflection delivered the same way with the same flat precision. It was not a defense. It was the line. I gave it the way I had always given it because it was the only thing I was permitted to give, and I had learned in places where permission is the difference between life and death that you do not improvise around classification. You hold the line. Hank laughed. Not a real laugh, the performative kind. The kind that needs an audience to function. Analysis. He looked at the crowd. That is what she always says. Analysis. You know what analysis means. It means she reads weather reports for contractors who do not care enough to check the forecast themselves. Cloud watching. He shook his head. It is not the military. It is barely a job. Anyone can see a storm coming. He said it the way he said everything. Loud enough that the words filled the space before anyone could question them. Cloud watching. The phrase landed in the yard and settled there like a stone dropped into still water. I could feel the ripples moving outward. I could feel 40 people absorbing those 2 words and fitting them into the framework Hank had built over 3 years, and I could feel the framework closing around me like a structure. I could not escape without breaking something classified. I placed my glass on the folding table beside me. Synoptic analysis for rotary wing insertion corridors accounts for convective instability at the aircraft altitude and wind shear gradient within the terminal approach zone. My voice was level, the same tone I used in briefing rooms, the same cadence I used when 11 people were waiting for a go or no-go, and the atmosphere was the only thing between them and the ground. An error of 2 degrees in the gradient assessment does not ground the mission. It puts 11 people in a falling aircraft. The yard did not move. I have made that call in the field with people lives on the result. Hank mouth opened, then closed. His phone lowered half an inch. Not all the way, just enough that his hand was no longer performing certainty. His eyes changed. Not understanding. Something before understanding. The fraction of a second where the brain registers that a sound does not match the pattern it was expecting and the body has not caught up yet. He blinked. Near the cooler, Colonel Raymond Webb had already set his plate down. He had been watching. Not me, not Hank, the space between us. The way you watch a weather system develop when you know the indicators and you are waiting for the front to arrive. He had recognized the burn pattern before he recognized my face. The hyperpigmented scarring along my left jaw running down the left side of my neck and disappearing beneath my collar. He had reviewed the medical report during my 5-day IV recovery at the compound. He had signed the commendation that described the injuries in language that was clinical and precise, and that would have meant nothing to anyone who had not been there. He knew the shape of that scar the way a surgeon knows the incisions he has read about in a case file and then sees years later on a stranger in a grocery store. Except I was not a stranger. I was his son neighbor, and he had spent the first hour of the cookout confirming what the scar had told him the moment he shook my hand and held it 1 beat too long. He had asked Derek questions, casual questions. The kind a father asks about his son neighborhood. How long has she lived there? Does she work from home? Does her husband travel? He was not making conversation. He was building a profile. 30 years of command had taught him to assemble data points before acting, and the data points had assembled themselves into a picture he had not expected to see at a backyard cookout in the Midwest on a Saturday in July. Webb stepped away from the cooler, not toward Hank, toward me. His movement was unhurried, controlled. The walk of a man who had spent 30 years entering rooms where the wrong speed communicated the wrong thing. He stopped close enough that only I could hear him. His voice was low, conversational, the kind of quiet that carries more authority than anything Hank had projected across that yard. What bearing did you report when you checked in? The yard had not noticed yet. 40 relatives were still processing what I had just said about convective instability and falling aircraft. Hank was still standing near the poster board with his phone half raised, caught between the accusation he had rehearsed and the sentence he had not expected. I looked at Webb. I did not blink. 273 magnetic. I had been walking 11 hours by then. I had 9 miles of bearing drift to correct. He said nothing for 2 full seconds. His jaw tightened once. Not surprise, not approval. Memory. The specific weight of a radio check-in he had waited 19 hours to receive coming back to him now in a suburban backyard in July. In the voice of the officer, he had refused to write off. He nodded once. Precise. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Webb turned and walked to the center of the yard. He did not look at Hank. He did not look at the poster board or the cooler or the 40 relatives who were beginning to register that something had shifted in the geometry of the afternoon. He walked with the measured stride of a man who had conducted briefings in tactical operations centers and addressed 4-star generals by their first names and never once raised his voice to be heard. He stopped. The yard went quiet in a way that was different from the silence after Hank accusation. That silence had been expectant. This silence was instinctive. The silence of people who can feel rank even when they cannot name it. The silence of people whose bodies understand before their minds do that the man now standing in the center of the yard occupies a space that does not negotiate with the space Hank has been occupying for the last hour. Sir, Webb said. He was addressing Hank, but his voice carried to every corner of the yard. Before you continue, I would like to make one phone call. On speaker. He did not wait for permission. The phone was already ringing. 2 rings. 3. The sound was absurdly ordinary, a phone ringing on a summer afternoon near a kettle grill that had stopped sizzling in a yard full of people holding paper plates and sweating beer cans. The normalcy of the sound made the abnormality of the context more acute, the way a familiar object in an unfamiliar room makes the room feel more strange. The line connected. James. Webb's voice was even professional, the voice of a commander addressing a subordinate he trusted. Say the name and the designation. A brief pause. Then a voice came through the speaker. Clear military cadence. The voice of Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart, retired, currently serving at United States Special Operations Command. Major Gretchen Kessler, Special Operations Weather Team Officer. Task Force Designation JSOTF West Africa. Operational call sign November 7. The words landed on the yard like individual stones dropped into still water, each one sending its own ripple. Each one arriving before the last had finished spreading. Major. Special Operations Weather Team Officer. Task Force Designation. Operational call sign. These were not words that belonged in a backyard. These were not words that belonged in the same sentence as cloud watching or Florida or personal problems. These were words that belonged in briefing rooms with classified stamps on the doors and encrypted communications, and people whose names you would never see in a searchable database, because the databases that contained them were not the kind you could search from a phone in the Midwest. Stewart continued, his voice did not waver. She was embedded with 3rd Special Forces Group for 36 months and authorized a helicopter insertion in Mali in March 2019 that her colonel refused to write off when the storm hit. A beat. The weight of it pressed the air. He kept that search open 19 hours, sir. Webb held the phone steady. Thank you, James. He ended the call. The only sound in the yard was a wind chime at the edge of the patio. It turned once without wind. Then it stopped. Webb did not pocket the phone. He held it at his side the way a man holds a tool he might need again. He turned to face the yard. 40 relatives. Hank near the poster board. Dale with his plate still in his hand. Ruth on the patio, absolutely still, her face unreadable. Aaron standing apart, arms at his sides, a warm beer he had forgotten about. Marcus near the fence watching Derek, Webb's own son, whose mouth was slightly open, whose eyes had gone wide, who was looking at his father as though the man standing in the center of the yard was someone he had never fully met. I am Colonel Raymond, Webb, United States Army, retired. Webb's voice carried without effort. I commanded the Joint Special Operations Task Force West Africa during this officer's 2nd year of assignment. I personally signed the mission orders that inserted her team into Mali. When a Class 4 sandstorm separated her from her unit during extraction, I was the senior officer in the Tactical Operations Center. He paused. The pause was not dramatic. It was precise. The kind of pause a commander uses when the next sentence contains information that changes the operating picture, and he needs every person in the room to be ready to receive it. I had the authority to close the search, to issue a presumptive killed in action designation. Pressure came from higher to do exactly that. His gaze moved across the faces in the yard, landing nowhere, seeing everyone. I refused. I said she was out there and she knew how to navigate. I told my staff to keep the extraction window open. He turned to me. 19 hours later, she walked back in on her own bearing using a compass and the stars. He held my gaze. His chin dipped once, precise, formal. The nod of a commanding officer recognizing a subordinate whose performance exceeded what any order could have required. Major, one word, my rank, spoken by a retired colonel in the center of a yard where my father had just told 40 people I was nothing. Not a salute. This was a civilian setting. He was retired. I was in jeans and a chambray shirt. But the title carried every ounce of authority a salute would have transferred, because the man who spoke it had earned the right to confer it, and every person in that yard understood instinctively that they were witnessing a transfer of hierarchy they had no framework for. I did not react. I held my position, my hands at my sides, the paracord bracelet against my wrist. The burn scar reddened along my jaw, my eyes steady. The yard fractured. Ruth's hand moved to her mouth slowly, as if she were catching something that had escaped. She had known. She had doubted the Florida story for years. She had never said it aloud. Now she did not need to. Dale set his plate down on the picnic table. The deviled eggs slid to the edge of the plastic platter and stopped. He took 2 steps backward, away from where Hank was standing, the way you step away from something you have been too close to for too long. Hank's girlfriend reached for the arm of her folding chair. She did not sit down. She held the frame like a railing. Derek Webb, my neighbor, the man who had invited me to the cookout, who had invited his own father without knowing what he was bringing into this yard, stood perfectly still with both hands at his sides. His face held the particular expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman who lived next door. The woman who borrowed his hedge trimmer. The woman who waved at him across the fence. The woman whose scar he had noticed and never asked about, because you do not ask about things like that. The woman who was apparently the reason his father had gone quiet on the drive over and had spent the first hour of the cookout standing near a cooler watching. Aaron did not move. He stood where he had been standing for the last hour, slightly apart, arms at his sides, present, not intervening, because I had told him years ago, when it matters, I will handle it myself. He was keeping that promise by doing nothing, and the steady certainty in his face, the quiet in his posture, told the yard everything it needed to know about a man who had trusted his wife through 6 years of silence without once demanding she fill it. Marcus stood near the fence, 11 years old. He had stopped playing when his grandfather raised his voice. He did not understand what a Class 4 haboob was, or what JSOTF West Africa meant, or why a man he had never met was calling his mother Major. But he understood the silence. He understood that every adult in the yard was looking at his mother, and that the looking was different now. The weight of it had changed. I found his eyes across the yard. He was watching me the way he watched, whether on his phone, studying, trying to read what the pattern meant. I held his gaze. 1 second. 2. Then I looked at my father. Hank's phone had lowered to his side. His arm hung at an angle that suggested he had forgotten he was holding it. The color had left his face in a way that did not happen all at once, but in stages, like a tide going out. First the confidence, then the certainty, then the architecture of the story he had built over 3 years, crumbling the way structures crumble when you remove the single load-bearing lie that held them up. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I did not know what that letter was. Webb voice, when it came, was not raised. It was not angry. It was factual. The tone of a man entering data into a record that would outlast this afternoon. You knew it came from the Air Force. That was enough. Hank swayed, not dramatically. The slight shift of a man whose center of gravity has moved without his permission. His hand closed around his phone. His other hand opened and closed at his side. I did not. His voice cracked. The sound of it crossed the yard like a fracture through ice. She never said. He stopped. Webb was already looking at his phone again. The record he had pulled up. The dependent inquiry, the filing, the administrative flag it had generated on my personnel file, the clearance review it had triggered during an active operational period, the cross-reference against my classified assignment. that had flagged the inquiry as fraudulent. The inquiry you filed with Air Force Personnel Center. Webb said measured precise, claiming your daughter abandoned family obligations. That inquiry generated an administrative flag on a classified service member file. It triggered a clearance review. It required 2 weeks of command-level response during an operational period. He looked at Hank, not with anger, with the specific disappointment of a man who has spent his career protecting the process that Hank had damaged without understanding it existed. The commendation certificate you destroyed has been flagged as intercepted and intentionally destroyed. That is a federal mail offense. The fraudulent filing determination has already been referred. Hank's hand dropped. His phone hung at his thigh. The poster board behind him with its 3 years of family photographs that did not include me seemed to lean in the heat as if even the foam core understood it was evidence. I did not. His voice stalled, his mouth opened and closed, and nothing followed. He did not finish the sentence. There was nothing after my name. There had never been anything after my name that was worse than anything he could have said. The yard held its breath. 40 relatives' paper plates, forgotten beer, sweating in hands that had stopped lifting them. The kettle grill cracked, once cooling metal contracting in the heat, and no one turned toward the sound. I looked at my father, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the steady level attention I had learned to give things that required accurate reading. Weather systems, atmospheric pressure, the distance between what a person says and what is true. You have spent my entire career making it smaller so it fit into something you could dismiss. My voice did not rise. It carried the way Webb had carried, without effort, without performance. The yard heard me anyway. The problem is not that I did not tell you. The problem is that I did. Every time you asked, I told you it was classified. And classified was a word you decided meant lying. I paused, not for effect, because the next sentence was heavier than the ones before it, and I wanted it to land with its full weight. You decided, and you filed a complaint against your own daughter command. You destroyed a letter with my name on it. Hank's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His eyes were wet, not tears. The glassy reflex of a body registering impact before the mind has processed the blow. I am not asking you to understand what I do, but I am done sitting still while you explain it to people who do not know any better. The yard was silent. The wind chime did not move. The air was flat and heavy and offered nothing. Hank found his voice. What was left of it? You could have told us something. I held his gaze. You did not ask. You decided. I asked for 3 years. You built a story. That is not the same thing. His hand came up, dropped, came up again, and found nothing to hold. The phone was still in his other hand, but it had become an artifact of a performance that was over. He looked at it like he did not recognize the object. I did not know that certificate was official. I thought it was. He stopped. He knew what he was about to say. He knew that whatever word he chose next would be the one the yard remembered. I did not know. Webb stepped forward. Not dramatically. One measured step. The movement of a man who has delivered operational assessments to rooms that shaped policy and who treats precision as a form of respect. The inquiry you filed triggered an active clearance review during an operational period. Webb voice was factual. Each sentence weighed and placed. That review required 2 weeks of command-level response. Your daughter was working in a classified assignment. The administrative disruption was real, and it was caused by you. He did not say people could have died. He did not need to. The silence after the statement filled with the implication, the way a room fills with smoke, slowly, then all at once. The fraudulent filing determination has been referred to Air Force Personnel Center for disposition. The destroyed commendation certificate constitutes interference with federal mail. Both matters are now documented. Webb delivered this without malice, without volume. The way you read coordinates into a log, accurate, permanent. Hank, brother-in-law Dale, stepped back from the space near the poster board. Not a dramatic retreat. The unconscious movement of a man who has realized he has been standing too close to something that is now evidence. His plate was already on the table. His hands went into his pockets. He did not look at Hank. Hank's girlfriend released the arm of the folding chair. She picked up her purse from the ground beside it. She did not leave. She held the purse against her stomach like a barrier. Her face was the face of a woman recalculating the cost of loyalty. One of Hank's cousins, a man named Gerald, who had been laughing at the cloud-watching line 10 minutes ago, turned his back to the center of the yard and walked to the cooler. He opened it. He did not take a beer. He closed it. He stood there with his hand on the lid, facing the fence, as though the view of the neighbor's siding was preferable to what was happening behind him. Ruth had not moved from the patio. She had not moved since before the phone call. She stood with her arms at her sides watching Hank with an expression that was not anger and was not pity. It was the expression of a woman who had doubted the Florida story for 3 years and had never said it aloud. She had been right. Being right did not appear to comfort her. Hank's hand dropped to his side. Both hands now the phone, the empty fingers. He looked at me, not at the yard, not at Webb. At me. Gretchen. His voice cracked again on my name. The same break as before, the same inability to produce anything after it. He swallowed. His chin dropped. Not a bow. A collapse that started at the top and had not finished traveling downward. I did not answer. Some people spend their lives making noise so nobody notices they have never done anything worth remembering. That is not a problem that belongs to me. I turned to Aaron. He was standing where he had been standing all afternoon, slightly apart, steady. His eyes met mine and held. He did not nod. He did not smile. He did not need to perform a single thing. He simply met my gaze with the same patient certainty he had met me with in the kitchen the night I told him I was leaving for 3 years. He had said, "I will be here." He had been here. Marcus was near the fence. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not confusion, not fear, the beginning of understanding, the look of an 11-year-old boy who had been tracking weather patterns on his phone without knowing why and who was now standing in the presence of the reason. I held his gaze. He held mine. I walked to the edge of the yard where Aaron was standing. I stood beside him, not touching close enough that our shoulders nearly met. He shifted his weight toward me by 1/2 inch. That was all. That was enough. Behind us, the yard was disassembling itself. The cookout was over. It had been over since Webb dialed the phone, but the mechanics of departure take time. People gathered plates, folded chairs, found keys. The conversations were murmured and short. No one approached Hank. No one approached me. The space between those two facts was the distance the family would spend years trying to cross. Webb walked to where Derek was standing. Derek looked at his father with the wide, recalibrated expression he had been wearing since the phone call. "Dad." Derek's voice was low. "She is my neighbor. I know," Webb said. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Brief, firm. "She is also the reason I came home from that assignment, knowing the people I sent out had someone watching the sky who would get it right." He did not look at me when he said it. He did not need to. Ruth was the last person to leave. She walked past me on her way to her car. She did not speak. She stopped. She looked at the scar along my jaw. The one the family had assumed was a skin condition, the one that had reddened in the July heat, and she looked at it the way you look at something you are seeing clearly for the first time after years of looking past it. She nodded once slowly, then she walked to her car and drove away. That was the only acknowledgement from the family that carried any weight. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were procedural. That is how consequences work, not with thunder, with paperwork. The paperwork moved without ceremony. The dependent inquiry was referred for fraudulent filing determination, the finding consistent with what Webb had already confirmed in the yard. Hank's name entered the record not as a concerned parent, but as an interference event. The destroyed commendation certificate was documented as intercepted federal correspondence. The reissue was processed through proper channels. It arrived at my installation 3 weeks after the cookout in an envelope with a routing stamp from Air Force Special Operations Command. Hank called Aaron twice. Aaron answered the first time. He listened for 40 seconds. Then he said, "She told you it was classified." That is where this stops. He hung up. He did not answer the second call. Hank called me once. I let it ring. There was a voicemail. I listened to it in the parking lot of the base commissary, sitting in my car with the engine off. His voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. He said he did not understand. He said he wanted to talk. He said my name 3 times. I deleted the voicemail not out of cruelty, not out of spite, because the conversation he was asking for required him to have listened years ago, and the years were already spent. Cousin Tommy called Ruth. Ruth told him what had happened. Tommy went quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "I do 1 weekend a month." She did 3 years embedded with Green Berets. Ruth said yes. Tommy said, "I need to sit down." That was the last anyone in the family brought up the National Guard comparison. Gerald, the cousin who had laughed at cloud watching, sent me a message on social media. 2 sentences. "I did not know. I am sorry. I read it." I did not respond. Not because the apology did not matter. Because the apology was for him, not for me. It was the kind of apology that functions as closure for the person who delivers it, not the person who receives it. He needed to send it. I did not need to read it twice. 2 weeks after the cookout, my installation 700. The badge reader accepted my card with a soft electronic chirp. The hallway smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee. The smell of every secure facility I have ever worked in. The smell that means you are in the right place. My name was on a placard beside my office door. Not a cover identity, not a contractor badge. Major Gretchen A. Kessler, USAF 15WX. I stood in front of that placard for 3 seconds. I had seen it every workday for months. It had never looked like this. It had never carried this particular weight. Not because anything about the placard had changed, because I had walked through a yard full of people who did not know my name meant anything, and now I was standing in a hallway where it meant everything. I sat down at my desk. The reissued commendation certificate was in a frame on the credenza. I had placed it there myself the day it arrived. The Air Force Special Operations Command crest in the corner, my name in the center, the specific language documenting performance during the Mali mission. The signature line where a colonel I had not known was watching me from 30 feet away at a cookout had signed his name 5 years ago. The paracord bracelet was on my left wrist, the mission number woven into the cord. Sergeant Nolan Hands had tied it. His wife note was in a drawer at home, folded into quarters, the creases permanent. He said you were the toughest person on the team. He meant it. I opened a weather analysis request from a current task force. I read the grid coordinates. I began working. The sky outside the window was clear, featureless, the kind of sky that gives you nothing to read. But I have spent 14 years learning that even a blank sky contains information if you know how to look. Pressure, humidity, the invisible architecture of the air. The truth is always there. You just have to be trained to see it. The night I walked back in from Mali, I found my bearing the same way I had been trained to find it, by looking up. The stars do not care what your father thinks you are doing. They hold their position. You find yours by theirs. That is navigation. That is also the rest of it. The rest of a life lived inside a silence that other people filled with whatever story was most comfortable for them. The rest of a marriage that held because the man in it understood that trust is not the absence of information, it is the presence of certainty. The rest of a son who will grow up knowing that his mother wore a paracord bracelet every day of his childhood, and that one day when he is old enough to understand what the pattern means, he will understand what it cost. The rest of a family that will spend years trying to cross the distance between what they believed and what was true, and some of them will make it, and some of them will not, and that is not my problem because I spent 3 years in denied environments doing work that none of them could pronounce, and I walked out of a desert on my own bearing, and I came home to a backyard where my father called me a cloud watcher, and I did not break, and I did not explain, and I did not need to because the truth was. Standing 30 feet away holding a beer he had not finished, and a phone he was about to use in a way that would make 40 people understand that some silences are not empty. Some silences are full. Full of things that cannot be said. Full of things that do not need to be said because they exist in records and in scars, and in the memory of a colonel who kept a search window open for 19 hours, and in the hands of a Green Beret who tied a knot in paracord 2 weeks before he was killed, and in the eyes of an 11-year-old boy who is just beginning to understand that his mother is not what his grandfather said she was. She is something his grandfather did not have the vocabulary to describe, and that is not her problem. That never was. If this story gave you chills, if you felt the weight of that silence in that backyard, if you understood what it means to stand still, while someone tries to make you small, then smash that like button right now, and tell us in the comments, what is the most satisfying moment of justice you have ever witnessed in your own life? And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the exact moment to do it, because the stories on this channel are not about revenge in the loud, explosive sense. They are about the kind of justice that comes from competence, from discipline, from people who do extraordinary things in silence, while ordinary people make noise about things they do not understand. That is what this channel is about. That is what these stories are for. Subscribe, ring the notification bell, and I will see you in the next one.